North Atlantic Ocean, 220 miles off Cape Cod, April 10th, 1963. At 8,400 feet below sea level, the USS Thresher's crew left something behind in the crushing darkness. Not their bodies. Those were found among the wreckage. Something else. Something that still sends out desperate signals on cold nights when submarines pass over that lonely grave of steel and shadows. From the depths of my collection, the War Maestro brings you a tale of the Cold War's darkest waters, where every ping of sonar might be an echo of those final, terrible moments, or something that refuses to accept its fate in the abyss. The early morning of April 10th, 1963, dawned cold and gray over the North Atlantic. The Cold War had pushed American engineering to new extremes, and the USS Thresher, SSN 593, represented the pinnacle of nuclear submarine technology. As the pride of the U.S. Navy's submarine fleet prepared for its deep diving tests, Commander John Wesley Harvey studied the morning's weather reports with methodical precision. The Thresher was a technological marvel, the lead ship of her class, designed to hunt Soviet submarines with unprecedented stealth and capability. At 278 feet long and armed with the latest sonar systems, she represented America's answer to the growing Soviet submarine threat. But on this morning, something felt different. Chief Engineer Lieutenant Raymond McCool noticed it first during his pre-dive checks. The readings were all within normal parameters, but there was a strange resonance in the hull, barely perceptible, like a whispered warning. He mentioned it to Commander Harvey, who acknowledged the concern, but noted that all systems showed green. They had a schedule to keep. As the 129 souls aboard, a mix of crew, civilian technicians, and observers, took their stations, Lieutenant James Corcoran caught snippets of unusual conversations. Veteran submariners, men who had logged thousands of hours underwater, spoke in hushed tones about an inexplicable sense of dread. The submarine's nickname among the crew, Silent Hunter, suddenly seemed less like a point of pride and more like an omen. The USS Skylark, their surface escort ship, maintained position above as the Thresher began her descent. The morning sun disappeared quickly as they submerged, replaced by the eternal darkness of the deep Atlantic. No one aboard could have known that they were beginning what would become one of the most chilling chapters in naval history, not just a disaster, but a descent into a nightmare that would haunt the U.S. Navy for decades to come. Commander Harvey's voice echoed through the command center. "Take her down to test depth." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, though none yet knew why. The Thresher slipped beneath the waves with the grace of a predator, while above, the bitter April wind churned the gray waters into white-capped swells, as if the ocean itself was trying to warn them of what waited in the abyss below. At 0747 hours, the USS Thresher began her fatal dive. Chief Sonar Technician William Carbino noticed something unusual almost immediately. The typically crystalline sounds of the deep were muffled, as if the ocean itself was holding its breath. His instruments showed nothing irregular, but 15 years of experience had taught him to trust his instincts. The submarine descended past 400 feet, then 600. Lieutenant McCool monitored the nuclear reactor's performance with growing unease. The gauges showed normal readings, but the humming of the reactor seemed different. Not wrong, exactly, but like a familiar song played in a minor key. At 0902 hours, Commander Harvey ordered a deeper test dive. The Thresher's hull groaned as they passed 700 feet, the sound echoing through the corridors like a metal giant gasping for air. Civilian technician Robert Steinel, aboard to observe the deep diving tests, made careful notes in his log. His last entry, recovered months later, would read, Unusual vibration patterns. Source unknown. The first real sign of trouble came at 0909 hours. A small leak in the engine room, hardly worth noting on a normal day. But this deep, even minor issues compound quickly. Chief Engine Man John Detreville dispatched a repair team, trying to ignore the way the leak's steady drip seemed to echo like a metronome, counting down to something inevitable. At 0911 hours, the USS Skylark received their first communication. Experiencing minor difficulties, the words crackled through the radio, distorted by depth and distance. Those monitoring the transmission would later swear there was something else in the background, a sound like fingernails dragging across steel. The Thresher continued her descent, now passing 800 feet. In the control room, Lieutenant John Hilary Walsh noticed the depth gauge needle trembling slightly, like a compass near a magnetic anomaly. He mentioned it to Commander Harvey, who was about to order a preliminary ballast blow when the first pipe burst. The sound wasn't loud, more like a muffled cough than an explosion. But in the pressurized confines of a nuclear submarine at test depth, it might as well have been a death knell. As icy seawater began to spray into the engine room, no one aboard yet realized that they had just passed the point of no return. They were still thinking in terms of procedures and protocols, not understanding that in the next few minutes they would experience horrors that no naval manual had ever contemplated. At 0913 hours, the message that would haunt the U.S. Navy for decades crackled through the USS Skylark's radio room. Experiencing minor difficulties, have positive angle, attempting to blow. The voice was calm, professional, the kind of composure that comes from years of naval training. But Chief Radio Man Walter Eichler, manning the Skylark's communications, detected something else in the transmission, a subtle tremor that made his skin crawl. In the Thresher's control room, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The initial pipe burst had triggered a cascade of system failures. Seawater spraying onto electrical panels created short circuits, sending showers of sparks through the darkening compartments. The emergency lights cast sickly yellow shadows that seemed to writhe across the walls, transforming familiar faces into grotesque masks of fear and desperation. Lieutenant Walsh watched in horror as the depth gauge needle continued its inexorable climb. 850 feet, 900, each number representing another step toward an unthinkable fate. The main ballast blow system, their primary means of surfacing, had failed. The backup hydraulic systems wheezed and stuttered, fighting against the crushing pressure of the deep. At 0916 hours, Commander Harvey ordered an emergency blow of all ballast tanks. The sound of compressed air rushing through the systems should have been reassuring. It was the sound of survival, of ascent. Instead, it came in strangled bursts, like the death rattle of a drowning giant. The high-pressure air, subjected to the intense cold of the depths, was freezing in the pipes, turning their escape route into a maze of ice-choked arteries. The final transmission came at 0917 hours. Test depth, test depth. Static crackled through the words, punctuated by sounds that no one in the Skylark's radio room could quite identify. Years later, analysis of the recording would reveal something chilling. In the background, barely audible beneath the static, were sounds that acoustic experts would compare to human fingernails scraping desperately against metal. Then came the noises that would feature in countless nightmares, a series of sharp, distinct popping sounds picked up by the Skylark's hydrophones. Not the sudden catastrophic implosion that the Navy had feared, but something far worse. Each pop represented another compartment succumbing to the pressure, another pocket of air, and possibly life, being crushed into nothingness by the merciless ocean. In the following moments of terrible silence, the crew of the Skylark could only stare at their instruments in horror, knowing that somewhere in the darkness below, 129 souls were experiencing a fate that no training manual had ever prepared them for. The U.S. Navy's initial search efforts revealed a truth more horrifying than anyone had imagined. The first photographs of the wreckage, taken by the bathyscaphe Trieste at 8,400 feet, showed something that defied the Navy's understanding of submarine disasters. The Thresher hadn't crumbled all at once. She had died inch by inch, compartment by compartment. Commander Dean Reynolds of the Naval Investigation Board studied the sonar recordings from that morning with growing unease. The sequence of pops suggested that some compartments had remained intact for minutes after the initial failure. Minutes that must have felt like eternities to anyone trapped inside, watching the hull around them slowly succumb to the crushing pressure. The recovery operation revealed other disturbing details. Inside the relatively intact sections of the engine room, investigators found evidence that challenged their assumptions about the crew's final moments. Handwritten calculations were discovered on technical manuals, showing desperate attempts to figure out emergency procedures. But it was the marks on the interior hull that haunted the recovery teams. Long, parallel scratches that could only have been made by human hands. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the Navy's lead forensic analyst, couldn't shake what she saw in those photographs. These weren't panic marks, she noted in her classified report. They were methodical, almost like someone was trying to count the seconds, marking time as the pressure increased. Some of these men remained conscious long enough to understand exactly what was happening to them. The most chilling evidence came from Chief Petty Officer James Thompson, sonar operator on the USS Skylark. In his official testimony, he described something the Navy tried to suppress for decades. After the final popping sounds, in the devastating silence that followed, his instruments picked up something else, a rhythmic tapping that followed no pattern he recognized, but was unmistakably deliberate. It continued for 17 minutes after all other sounds had ceased. The Navy's official report would eventually conclude that the Thresher's loss was due to a catastrophic mechanical failure. But those who worked on the investigation knew there was more to the story. The pattern of the destruction, the evidence of sustained consciousness in impossible conditions, the unexplained signals, it all pointed to a fate worse than simple drowning or implosion. As one investigator wrote in his personal journal, later found in a sealed naval intelligence archive, "We're trained to face death at sea. But what happened to the Thresher's crew? Being awake and aware as the ocean slowly crushed them into darkness, that's something no human being was ever meant to endure." 6 months after the Thresher's loss, the USS Seawolf passed through the area during a routine patrol. Lieutenant Marcus Chen, manning the sonar station, first noticed the anomalies. The water temperature dropped dramatically, far more than normal ocean thermoclines could explain. The nuclear submarine's electrical systems began experiencing inexplicable fluctuations. But it was the sounds that disturbed the crew most. Chief Petty Officer Richard Drake, a 20-year veteran of submarine operations, documented strange acoustic signatures in his log. 0300 hours. Picked up what sounds like mechanical working noises at bearing 047. No vessels reported in vicinity. 3115 hours. Sounds resembling hull creaking, but not our hull. 0330 hours. Clear knocking sequence. Pattern matches old emergency communications protocol. Repeating digits. 593. Thresher's hull number. The Seawolf wasn't the only vessel to experience unexplainable phenomena near the Thresher's final resting place. In 1965, the USS Nautilus reported similar incidents. Sonar technician First Class James Martinez recorded sounds that he initially attributed to whales or submarine activity. But analysis of the tapes revealed something more unsettling. Voices speaking in whispers, too distorted to make out words, but clear enough to recognize human speech patterns. The crew of the Skipjack had perhaps the most disturbing experience in 1967. During a deep diving exercise near the site, they encountered what Captain Robert Larson described in his classified report as a zone of absolute silence. All ambient ocean noise ceased. The sonar displays showed crystal clear readings, but the hydrophones picked up nothing, as if that section of ocean had been entirely evacuated of sound. Then came the temperature drops. Not the gradual cooling you'd expect at depth, but sudden, localized cold spots that defied physics. Engineering Officer Lieutenant Paul Watson reported frost forming on the interior walls of the control room, impossible at their operating depth and temperature. But most chilling were the handprints that appeared in the frost, pressed against the metal from the outside, at depths where no diver could possibly survive. The Navy's official stance was clear. These incidents were to be classified and not discussed outside secure briefings. But the submarine's crews knew what they had experienced. As one senior chief noted in his personal log, "We're taught that the ocean is unforgiving, that pressure and cold are our enemies. But after what we've witnessed near the Thresher site, I'm starting to think there are worse things in the deep than just physics and nature. Sometimes, when I'm on watch and the sonar goes quiet, I can't shake the feeling that something down there is listening back." By the 1990s, the Navy had established an unofficial dead zone around the Thresher's resting place. Modern submarines were quietly ordered to avoid the area when possible. Those that did pass through reported increasingly disturbing phenomena that seemed to defy rational explanation. Commander Sarah Mitchell of the USS Connecticut remembered her 1998 transit vividly. The sonar station picked up what sounded like metal groaning under pressure, exactly like what you'd hear during a deep dive. Except we were at standard depth, nowhere near crush depth. Then the temperature in the control room dropped so rapidly that our breath started fogging. My executive officer, a man with 15 years of submarine experience, started shaking uncontrollably. He swore he could hear voices in the ventilation system, whispering hull numbers over and over. The most thoroughly documented incident occurred in 2005 aboard the USS Virginia during sea trials. Chief Engineer Thomas Rodriguez was inspecting the nuclear reactor compartment when all electrical systems suddenly malfunctioned. In the pitch darkness, he felt what he described as a hand, ice cold and dripping wet, grab his wrist. When emergency lighting restored power 47 seconds later, his wrist bore marks of severe frostbite in a distinct pattern of fingers. Lieutenant Jessica Chen, the Virginia's sonar officer, recorded something equally inexplicable that day. The hydrophones picked up a series of sounds that exactly matched the last known transmission sequence from the Thresher. When we ran it through acoustic analysis, we found something impossible. The sound signatures were identical down to the microsecond. It wasn't an echo or a recording. It was as if the Thresher was making those exact same distress calls again, right then, 42 years later. The crew's experiences left lasting psychological scars. Petty Officer Michael Banks, who had been in the reactor room with Rodriguez, requested transfer to surface ships immediately after the incident. In his final submarine service evaluation, he wrote, "There are things down there that don't show up on sensors, things that shouldn't exist at those depths. Sometimes at night, I still feel that cold hand reaching for me, and I know, It's trying to show me what the Thresher's crew felt in their final moments. A classified Navy memo from 2010 acknowledged these incidents, but offered no explanation. While the phenomena reported in the vicinity of the SSN 593 wreck site remain unexplained, all submarine commanders are advised to maintain standard operating protocols and report any anomalous experiences through secure channels. Under no circumstances should crew members be informed of previous incidents prior to transit through the area. In January 2023, the Office of Naval Research launched an autonomous underwater vehicle to conduct a detailed survey of the Thresher's wreck site. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, lead scientist for the project, designed the mission to finally document the full extent of the wreckage using the latest in deep-sea imaging technology. What they found would force the Navy to re-examine everything they thought they knew about the disaster. The initial scans revealed that the wreck site had changed. Sections of the hull that should have collapsed decades ago under the crushing pressure somehow remained intact. More disturbing were the temperature readings, localized cold spots that formed perfect circles, exactly matching the diameter of the Thresher's crew compartments. At 09:17 hours, 60 years to the minute after the Thresher's final transmission, the drone's sensors detected something unprecedented. Chief Technical Officer Mark Thompson described it in his report. All instruments simultaneously registered a massive temperature drop, followed by clear acoustic signatures. The pattern matched the Thresher's original distress sequence perfectly, but this was no echo. The sounds were coming from inside the still intact compartments. The drone's cameras captured images that defied explanation. Through the murky depths, they recorded what appeared to be lights moving inside the wreck. Not reflections, but deliberate patterns that naval cryptographers would later identify as matching old emergency signal protocols. Then, the drone's backup systems detected movement. The last transmission, before it went offline, contained 3 words, repeated in a loop. Still here, still here, still here. When they recovered the drone 2 weeks later, its exterior was marked with the same parallel scratches found inside the Thresher's hull. The drone's memory contained one final image, a perfectly clear shot through a breach in the wreck's hull, showing a handprint pressed against the inside of a window, fresh in the silt that should have covered everything decades ago. The Navy's official statement called it a technical malfunction, but Dr. Rodriguez knew better. In her personal notes, sealed away in ONR archives, she wrote, "We think of time as linear, of death as final. But in the crushing depths where the Thresher rests, something impossible has happened. Those men are still there, still conscious, still dying. Not just their bodies or their spirits, but their experiences, their terror, their final moments, repeating endlessly in the dark. The abyss doesn't just preserve, it traps. And sometimes, when we send our machines and our sensors into that darkness, they don't just record the past. They witness it, still happening, still fresh, still deadly after all these years." The USS Thresher story remains officially closed. But on cold nights, when submarines pass through that patch of ocean, sonar operators still report hearing those 3 words, growing clearer with each passing year. Still here, still here, still here. If this dive into the War Maestro's archive left you with a chill that even the deepest ocean can't match, consider joining our crew. Check your depth gauge. Notice how it's reading impossibly deep, even though you're on dry land. And subscribe to explore more classified military horrors. Activate that notification bell. You'll want to know when our next restricted file surfaces from the depths. Share this tale with fellow enthusiasts who understand that sometimes the darkest horrors lurk in declassified documents and military logs. Leave a comment below. Have you ever experienced unexplainable phenomena during naval operations? Or perhaps you have your own story of when standard military procedure met the unexplainable. Remember, some sonar signatures are still waiting to be identified, and some distress calls are still echoing in the deep.